You walk into a restaurant. The host gestures toward a perfectly good table right in the middle of the room, open, well lit, plenty of space. And something in you immediately, quietly, firmly says no. Not that table. You scan the room without even thinking about it. There, the corner booth, the one with the wall behind it and a clear view of the door. That one. You sit down, put your back against the wall, and feel your shoulders drop about 2 inches. You didn't plan that. You didn't consciously decide it. It just happened, the way breathing happens. And if someone took that seat before you could, if you were forced to sit exposed in the middle of the room with people moving behind you, you'd spend the entire meal slightly distracted, slightly tense, slightly somewhere else. Sound familiar? Most people who do this have been doing it so long they've stopped noticing it. It's just a preference, they say. I like to see what's going on. I don't like people behind me. And their friends roll their eyes affectionately and let them have the corner seat every time because it's easier than arguing about it. But here's what nobody's asking, and what I want to dig into today is why. What is actually happening in the brain and nervous system of a person who cannot comfortably sit with their back exposed to a room? Because the answer is not simply they're paranoid or they watch too many spy movies. The answer touches on threat detection, trauma, evolutionary psychology, hypervigilance, and a nervous system that is doing exactly what it was designed to do, just perhaps in a context that no longer requires it. Let's start at the very beginning, because the instinct to keep your back protected and your eyes on the entrance is not a quirk. It is ancient. It is written into the operating system of the human animal at a level that predates language, cities, restaurants, and everything else we consider modern life. Our ancestors who survived were the ones who didn't sit with their backs to the cave entrance. The ones who could see the predator coming had a survival advantage that compounded over tens of thousands of years. The preference for what psychologists and environmental designers call prospect and refuge, a high vantage point with a protected back and a clear view of the surrounding landscape, is one of the most consistent findings in environmental psychology. Researcher Jay Appleton built an entire theory around it in the 1970s. We are drawn at a deep biological level to spaces that offer us visibility without exposure. We want to see without being seen. We want to watch the door without being the person who gets surprised by what comes through it. So before we go any further, if you always sit with your back to the wall, your nervous system is not broken. It is ancient. It is doing something that kept your ancestors alive. The question is just about calibration, about whether the system is running at the right volume for the actual environment you're in. Now let's talk about what turns this ancient instinct from a mild preference into something more consuming. Because for most people, the back-to-the-wall thing is a gentle pull, a first choice, easily overridden if the seating situation requires it. But for some people, it's not gentle at all. It's a need. And if that need isn't met, the discomfort doesn't quietly fade. It sits right there at the table with them, a constant low hum of unease that never fully lets them relax, never fully lets them be present in the conversation, never quite lets them enjoy the meal. That experience, that inability to settle, to release, to stop monitoring, has a name in psychology. It's called hypervigilance. And it is one of the most common and least understood features of a nervous system that has learned, usually through experience, that the world requires watching. Hypervigilance is not paranoia. It's not irrational fear. It is a system that has been updated by experience to treat the environment as a source of potential threat and to stay perpetually ready for that threat to materialize. It's the nervous system's way of saying, I have been surprised before. I will not be surprised again. And here's the crucial thing about hypervigilance. It feels like awareness. It feels like intelligence even. The person who is always scanning the room, always tracking the exits, always noting who just walked in. They often experience this as a kind of competence, as being switched on, attentive, prepared. And in many ways, it is a form of competence. These people are genuinely good at reading environments. They notice things other people miss. They are rarely caught off guard, but the cost is real and it is significant. Because the nervous system does not distinguish between scanning for genuine threat and scanning for imaginary threat. The physical experience is the same. The cortisol is the same. The low-level activation of the stress response is the same. And living in that state, even at a low level, even in a perfectly safe restaurant, is exhausting in ways that accumulate quietly over years. Where does hypervigilance come from? This is where the story gets deeply personal because the pathways are different for different people. For some people, it comes from trauma, from experiences that taught the nervous system, viscerally and unmistakably, that threat is real and that not being prepared for it has consequences. Research on PTSD has consistently found that hypervigilance, including specific behaviors like positioning oneself with a view of all exits, is one of the most reliable indicators of a nervous system that has been through something it hasn't fully processed yet. Veterans describe it. Survivors of abuse describe it. People who grew up in unpredictable, volatile households describe it. The detail changes. The mechanism is the same. The brain learned that safety is not guaranteed, and it adjusted its settings accordingly. But trauma in the clinical sense is not the only origin story. For some people, the hypervigilance developed in environments that were subtler, households where the emotional atmosphere was unpredictable, where moods shifted without warning, where a child learned very early to read the room before entering it, to check the emotional temperature, to position themselves where they could see what was coming. These people may not identify as trauma survivors. They may have perfectly normal-seeming childhoods in the story they tell about themselves, but their nervous systems learn the same lesson. Watch your environment. Know what's behind you. Don't be caught off guard. There's a term in developmental psychology called ambient threat, the experience of growing up not in a single dramatic event, but in a persistent atmosphere of uncertainty or tension. An ambient threat, it turns out, shapes the nervous system in many of the same ways acute trauma does. The child who grew up waiting for a parent's mood to turn, who learned to read footsteps in a hallway, who developed an almost superhuman sensitivity to tension. That child becomes an adult who cannot comfortably put their back to a room. Not because something terrible is about to happen, but because the nervous system never received reliable evidence that it wouldn't. Now I want to bring in something that I find genuinely fascinating, which is the intersection between this behavior and personality. Because not everyone who sits with their back to the wall has a trauma history. Some people simply have a nervous system that runs hotter, more reactive, more sensitive, more attuned to environmental stimulation than average. Research on the trait of sensory processing sensitivity, studied extensively by psychologist Elaine Aron, has found that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population has a nervous system that processes sensory information more deeply than the norm. These are people for whom a busy, noisy, movement-filled room is simply more activating than it is for others. And one of the ways that higher activation manifests is a preference for positioning that reduces unpredictable stimulation. Sitting against a wall eliminates an entire hemisphere of potential input. It narrows the sensory field. It makes the environment more manageable. For these people, the back-to-the-wall preference is less about threat and more about regulation. It's not that they're afraid of what's behind them. It's that having something behind them allows them to be fully present to what's in front of them, without their nervous system spending resources on monitoring what they can't see. It's efficiency. It's a form of environmental engineering, the quiet, unconscious optimization of a sensitive system that works best when it isn't overloaded. And isn't that actually kind of remarkable? Without ever taking a psychology course, without ever reading Elaine Aron or Jay Appleton or anything about threat detection or sensory processing, these people figured out, through pure lived experience, how to make themselves feel better in a challenging environment. They developed a behavioral strategy that works, and they've been using it, quietly and consistently, probably their entire lives. So what do we do with all of this understanding? Because understanding is one thing, but the practical question, especially for people whose hypervigilance is more intense, more consuming, more exhausting, is what comes next. And here I want to be honest with you. For a lot of people, this behavior pattern is not something to be eliminated. It's something to be understood. The wall seating preference in and of itself is not a problem. It costs nothing. It harms no one. If it helps your nervous system feel regulated and present, use it. Always take the corner booth. There is no prize for making yourself sit in the middle of the room if it means spending the entire dinner somewhere else in your head. But if the hypervigilance is broader than seating preferences, if it's affecting sleep or relationships or the ability to be present in your own life, then the understanding we built today is the beginning of something more. Because once you can name what your nervous system is doing and why, you have something you didn't have before. Choice, not the ability to immediately override the system. The nervous system doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something, but the ability to start a gentle, ongoing conversation with it. To say, I see what you're doing. I understand why you learned this. And I'm going to start showing you, slowly, that we might be safe. That conversation, with a therapist, with a somatic practice, with time and patience, and a willingness to be curious rather than ashamed, is how the calibration slowly shifts. Not toward naivety, not toward dropping your awareness entirely, but toward a version of watchfulness that doesn't cost you everything. Toward being able to sit with your back to the wall and feel settled, rather than sitting with your back to the wall and still not quite feeling safe enough. Because at the end of the day, the person who always finds the corner seat is a person who has been paying attention their whole life, who has taken the business of survival seriously in a way that most people never have to, who has developed a sensitivity and an awareness that, channeled well, is genuinely one of the most remarkable things a nervous system can do. The goal is not to lose that sensitivity. The goal is to make it work for you rather than on you. If this resonated, if you found yourself nodding along, or if it made you think of someone you love, I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Do you always take the corner seat? Did this explain something about yourself you'd never quite been able to put into words? And if this is the kind of content that makes you feel a little more understood, subscribe. Because every week we go somewhere like this, somewhere honest. See you in the next one.